record. Well, first and foremost, I feel we talk a lot about TikTok on this show and how my storied relationship with trying to be more Gen Z on TikTok. But I feel like, Dr. Raegan, you have cracked the TikTok code. You are one of the Gen Z. You are a TikTok queen, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm definitely not Gen Z, but we are trying very hard to sort of reach people where they are. And the reality is that many more young people are getting information on TikTok, including information about the news and including their health information. And so we've been deliberately trying to put more content there. And it's been a really great opportunity to reach folks. So there was a video that I posted over the summer, simple video just about how long an abortion takes that explains a little bit about the differences between medication abortion and procedural abortion. And that video has over 1 million views already. We also have views that have been really popular about, like, can you get pregnant in a pool or a hot tub, which is a really common question that we get, and have some content about on our website as well. And then another video was about throwing up the birth control pill and like sort of what to do, which is a really common scenario. Someone might miss a pill or throw up a pill or something like that. So all in all, we're reaching people where they are, and that is become increasingly important as it can be really hard to navigate the healthcare system and get answer to the questions that people need.
Well, and it's amazing that, well, first of all, I need to know if you can get pregnant in a hot tub or a pool. But and so we'll circle back to that because I'm like, I know you can definitely get a STI or a UTI and all sorts of things in a hot tub or a pool. But when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, it's like and I grew up in San Francisco. Some people kind of, I think if you're not from San Francisco, look at it as a really liberal place, but it can be actually quite conservative. There's
Yeah.
definitely, pockets and whatnot. Luckily, I was in California, which generally speaking is typically a Democratic, more liberal state, or has been, but wasn't always. But, really the only place we had for reproductive information, care, women's care, and otherwise, if you didn't have cool parents that were talking to you about it, which I did not. I had like much older parents, was Planned Parenthood.
Yep.
So it's incredible that you're sharing information about, reproductive health options, like what, those, with periods can do in regards to, either abortion care or pregnancy health and that. But before we get too deep, can you get pregnant in a hot tub or a pool? Like, talk to me right now.
Yeah.
Like, I need to know.
Yeah. So first of all, sidebar, I think, people sort of romanticize, and there's a lot of like TV and film content that romanticize penis and vagina sex in like hot tubs and pools and showers. And because of the way that bodies work and lubrication works, it's actually like not that fantastic. So that aside, typically
The
no,
worst.
like,
It's the worst,
yeah.
actually.
I mean, anytime someone is having penis and vagina sex, there's a possibility of pregnancy, and so that's really important to note. And as you said, people also worry about getting infections. Usually, the heat is high enough and there's enough chlorine in there to kill bacteria. That assuming that it's well maintained, but it is something to be concerned about. But in terms of getting pregnant. You can't get pregnant just from sitting in a pool or a hot tub, but if you have penis and vagina sex in a pool or a hot tub, it is possible to get pregnant.
What a time. What a time. I just
What
think of
a
all
time.
of the, yeah. And I think even just, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Sex and water, actually, regardless if it's penis and vagina sex, because I've had both. I've had vagina, penis and vagina sex in bodies of water. And both of them, while the partner might have been great, it wasn't the best.
Yeah.
It's really not the best. So it sounds like you get that question a lot. What are some of the most frequent questions you get about, women's health, reproductive health on TikTok?
Yeah, that's a really big one. Another question that's often asked is about if it's okay to use drugs, specifically cannabis, before having an abortion,
Hmm.
or drinking before or after an abortion. Again, what to do if you miss a pill. Is it okay to take 2 pills in a day is another really, really common one. And then people often have questions about their own medical concerns and whether or
Yeah.
not birth control is safe for them. So, for example, like I'm a smoker, what birth control pills can I take? Or I have fibroids or other conditions. And so it's, not uncommon for people to post these questions on TikTok or Twitter or other places, and they're seeking answers. And oftentimes there aren't, trained medical providers answering their questions there. So that's a space that we're trying to lean more into.
I love that because, you know, it's great that you are trained for a lot of medical professionals don't use a lot of social media. I know even my wife, who she's a mental health provider, but she doesn't like being on social. So I think it's so incredible that you've created this platform where there is sound information being shared by you, but then also you can be a soundboard for people. Obviously, people should go and see I'm sure their own medical professionals in person if they can, and etc. But it's really, that's the wonderful part about the internet, right? Like, I think there's a lot of downsides that we talk about, misinformation, as you mentioned at the top of our conversation. There's like bullying, but then there's also this beautiful thing about social media and the internet where information can get shared and it can go to places that somehow, have been sheltered from information from their own familiar situation or their education. You know what I mean? It's actually a wonderful, wonderful thing.
That's right. I mean, just as you stated, it's like a really powerful tool, right? And like, remember when like newspapers came out, people were like, oh, this is, terrible. People are going to propagate bad information. And the same thing with the internet came out. Like, it's a tool just like any other, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're using that tool responsibly and flooding it with evidence-based information that people can access in a way that's understandable, and to them and resonates with them, which again is what we're trying to do at Power to Decide with our assets like Bedsider, and our content with abortionfinder.org. And it's a really important way to democratize access to this important information because people largely aren't getting comprehensive sex ed in their schools, right? Like, it largely depends on
No.
like where you happen to live. And, if you win the parental lottery and have parents that are going to have these conversations with you, but unfortunately, many of us hadn't. And I didn't realize actually how uncommon this was until I went to college and realized that so many of my peers around me had sort of never had these conversations with their own parents about sex and pleasure and protection and sexually transmitted infections. And although I had older parents who were very religious, they sat me down and had these conversations with me, I think because they had raised other children and perhaps didn't have those conversations in a constructive way. And people, are seeking that information and are often going to talk to their friends who don't know anything,
Right.
oftentimes. So we have these powerful tools through the internet, through social media, to democratize access to this important information. And it's unfortunate, right, that we can't count on communities and schools and some of the traditional places where sex ed was provided to do that. But we have this really great, powerful tool to sort of step into that gap and help people find out more about their bodies and healthy relationships and contraception and how to protect themselves. And so I'm really excited to be creating these videos and increasing more access to information for young people.
100%. I mean, it's an amazing thing what you're doing. And also, I think given where we are from a legislative standpoint with Roe versus Wade, I love that you're talking about obviously everybody's options, but not only abortion care, but also to prevent pregnancies if you're not in a moment where you want to be pregnant. I mean, so I remember in high school, like, friends getting pregnant, and it was just like, it was so intense and so emotional. And luckily I had a good friend group and we all supported each other. But like, I definitely went to Planned Parenthood a few times with friends who got abortions.
Yep.
It's terrifying and it's scary. And I think it's interesting because it's like, oh, well, it was, 20 years ago. But we had Planned Parenthood, and it was actually, the providers there were incredible. The people that worked at Planned Parenthood were always really, really kind. Even when I went myself, like, I got my first pap smear out of Planned Parenthood because I had, older friends that were talking about it, but my mom wasn't talking to me about it. And I knew, that was something maybe I should go do or, get at least an exam. But then 20 years later, I'm like, oh my God, are we even in a worse place than we were 20 years
Yeah,
ago? I mean, we are. It's just
we
a
are.
really,
We absolutely
yeah,
are.
you
Yeah.
know?
And it's so sad, right? Like I dream of a reproductive health utopia where abortion's not stigmatized. And if somebody ends up getting pregnant in a time that doesn't make sense for them, it's not a big deal for them to get abortion care in a person-centered manner in their own community, in a way that makes sense for them. Like that is a utopia that we should still try to fight towards. But the reality is that is absolutely not the case for almost half the country right now, where people don't have access to abortion in their own community, without potentially legal risks or having to travel, out of state. And it's important for people to know that abortion is common. 1 in 4 people of reproductive age will have an abortion at some point in their lifetime, right? And people who have abortions are more likely to live with lower incomes and to be people of color. And so those are the people that are having to navigate this incredibly dangerous and complicated system of traveling out of state.
Yeah.
People who have abortions are also more likely to already be parents. So they're not only having to like save money to try to figure out how to get abortion care in another state, they're also having to navigate childcare and what to do with their current children. I mean, it's really a sad state where we could be putting more resources into education and prevention and this utopia where abortion is not stigmatized and available when people need it, but instead we're doing the exact opposite, and potentially creating a system where people are having to bankrupt themselves or make really hard decisions about, what bills to pay or not pay, or childcare to pay or not pay to access essential reproductive health services.
I mean, it's bleak. It's really, and because it's true. How, if you have a small child and you need to travel out of state, like, what are you going to do?
Yeah,
It's heartbreaking, I think,
yeah,
from, you know what I mean? It really, really, it breaks my heart. And, I work with a lot of young people, and, growing up in San Francisco in the 90s, the AIDS crisis was
mm,
really, really like in
yeah,
our faces. My cousin passed away. I saw his partner and his friends pass away. As a 10-year-old, like, seeing the AIDS and HIV crisis
mhm,
was wild. I mean, really, truly, yes, pregnancy was always on my mind when having sex with men, where I was like, whoa, nope, nope, no, pregnancy, but it was also sexually transmitted
of
diseases,
course,
which
yeah,
I feel like now, especially with online dating, I don't know. I mean, I hear a lot of young women I know that have heterosexual sex. They're like, I never use protection. And I'm like,
mm,
girl, what are you talking about? I mean, and
yeah,
it's so interesting because 20 years ago, I really feel like safe sex was in the zeitgeist. Like, you saw it on
yeah,
MTV, you saw TLC, like, using condoms in their music videos, which I love. And then there was this weird wave, and maybe I'm wrong. And again, I'm in a very different life place than I was. Like, I mean, I'm trying at this point to get pregnant, so, which we'll get to in a moment, because kind of
yes,
opposite, but like, you know, it feels like no one's really talking even just about like safe sex, like how to
yeah.
protect yourself from a variety of things. And I think that is so troubling as well.
You're not wrong. And I will say, as someone who had close family members, including one of my brothers who passed away
I'm
from
sorry.
complications of AIDS, like this is something that is really important. And you're not wrong that people aren't talking about safe sex as much. And the result of that is that sexually transmitted infections are increasing in the
Yeah.
United States. In fact, we're seeing rates of syphilis right now in parts of the country that are higher than ever before. And in part, it could be because now, thankfully, right, like we have these amazing tools, medical technologies that can help prevent HIV infections in the form of PrEP medications, right?
Mhm.
And we have highly active antiretroviral therapy, such that, like, if we really invested in this, we could get rid of HIV in our
Right.
communities now, right? Those things are real, and sort of now HIV has become something that people can live with and die of other causes, which is great and brilliant, but it can mean that in some contexts that people are less likely to use condoms. The other thing is there's just like less investment in our public healthcare system, and we saw the ramifications of that during the pandemic, right?
Right.
Where we were struggling to sort of create infrastructure to test people for COVID and treat them, et cetera. That is also the case for sexually transmitted infections. And so it's not surprising that rates of chlamydia and gonorrhea and syphilis specifically are rising. And again, we have all of the technology, we have all of the willpower to actually completely change the tide. Rather, we have the technology and we have the capacity to change the tide. What is missing is the willpower and the investment to do that.
You get a lot of questions from either bisexual or heterosexual women about PrEP online ever?
So definitely from bisexual women, not
Yeah,
so much, and from heterosexual women. Yeah,
sure.
definitely. I mean, I think people sort of think of PrEP more for MSM, for men who have sex with men.
Right.
But in some communities, especially among Black women that identify as heterosexual, they can have significantly high rates of risk of HIV compared to other women. So it's really important that people are aware of this technology and not just think of it as something that's only for men who have sex with men.
Yeah, I interviewed a local government official in Atlanta, and we had a long conversation about women who, specifically Black women who identify as heterosexual in his community. They were seeing really large, you know, numbers of HIV, like folks getting HIV, and I
New
was wondering,
infections.
yeah,
Yeah.
new infections, and we were talking about PrEP because I mean, listen, most of my gay and queer male friends are on PrEP. It's just something, I never really thought of. I also haven't had sex with a man in 11 years, 10, whatever, since before I met my wife. So a long, long time. So,
Yeah.
and I know things have really changed in the last 10 years, but it's just something, when I see young folks and I hear young folks and they're telling me that they aren't using even just, preventative methods like condoms for pregnancy or whatever, I'm like, dude, think about PrEP, something.
Yeah.
Like, what are you
Yeah, I mean,
talking
there's
about?
so much training that needs to be done for
Yeah,
providers to be able to like adequately have these conversations with their patients and to be able to just ask the basic questions of like, who are you having sex with? What body parts do they have?
yeah, yeah,
Who
yeah.
are their sexual partners? And to be able to sort of stratify and mitigate risk. There's a huge lack of training on the
Yeah.
part of providers to be able to like have those really important conversations. And then there's a lack of awareness about PrEP and that it's available and that it's super effective and safe. So it's really great that you're lifting this up for your listeners.
Yeah, 100%. Ladies, listen, prep for your kids too. Yeah, no, 100%. That's why I like to have these. I think for so long, there were conversations that were like queer conversations and then straight conversations. And what I love about this show, I loved my last show. I loved all my babies. I love them all. But for this one, I really love the fact that yeah, we talk about a lot of queer stuff on this show, but we're blurring the lines here on
Yeah.
especially with a generation on TikTok, a lot of Gen Z folks, queerness and a lot of their issues are starting to blend together, and
Yeah.
their friend groups and what they talk about. So I think it's important for everyone to know, like, gay issues are everybody's issues. PrEP should be
Yeah.
everybody's issues. HIV, AIDS, abortion care legitimately should be every person in this world, in this country. It should be everyone's issue. It's not just
Everyone's issue.
somebody with a uterus. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it's everybody's issue.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's absolutely what I'm seeing in my clinical practice, that there's more gender fluidity. There's more fluidity of whose people's partners are and what body parts they have and how they refer to them.
Sure.
So again, more just awareness of this and then sort of suggesting care or based on an individual's sort of life circumstances, the partners that they're having, the types of sex that they're having. But again, providers need to be trained to have those conversations in order to be able to recommend what's appropriate for the individual.
I am in the process of trying to get pregnant. It is very different than what I saw growing up with heterosexual parents. Yes, I had a lot of, queer people in my life growing up, but
Yeah.
none of them really had children. I was a nanny for a lovely gay couple, and they had used surrogacy and a donor egg. So I,
Okay.
knew those kinds of options about that, younger, I guess, maybe more than others, etc. Adoption, obviously, which is a wonderful option for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
but for me, it's like, I've got to pick a sperm donor, which let me tell you, it's a very weird process. It's a very weird process to look at like baby photos and charts and what have you. It's definitely something different, but then also preparing my own body for IUI and
Hmm.
IVF. And also the assumptions that people make
Yeah.
immediately are pretty crazy. Is there anything like, do you ever give anyone any kind of like advice if they're the person about to embark in insemination? Because it's, obviously different if you at one point I talked to one practitioner, they're like, yeah, just like have a lot of sex. I'm like, are you not hearing that I don't have sex with men? Like, what are you talking about right now? So how can one, do you have any advice in terms of like people who are about to go into an IUI or an IVF process for their bodies, like even just generally?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think taking a step back, making sure that you have a trusted provider with whom you feel safe and comfortable and who
Sure.
understands your situation and goals is like paramount, right?
Yeah.
And so that people are not speaking to a circumstance that doesn't apply to you. Ideally making sure you understand your menstrual cycle and tracking ovulation. You'd be surprised actually, like because of like what we talked about before and just like low health literacy about reproductive health, that many people just don't even like understand like when they can get pregnant, right? So that's really important. There are a lot of fertility kits and monitors available that can help, as well as just things you can do to track your cervical mucus. I love saying cervical mucus, and
People
to
love
help
that
you as
cervical.
well.
Yeah, let's talk about. Well, so I have used a period tracker, which by the
Hmm.
way, it's free. I think it's called like My Period. I had like some crazy, crazy period, whatever. I got my period really young. I got my period at 10, which let me tell you, nobody was talking. They were like, what? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You're a freak, all those amazing things. But was having heavy, heavy periods. So I wanted to like track whatever. So I've been tracking my period for like 14 years, which is
Wow. That's a lot of
amazing.
data.
It's a lot of data and it's free on the app. So that's been really amazing. But how are those ovulation? Like you can like plug them into your phone. So do you have any patients that have used any of those or are you familiar? Like, do those work? It seems
Yes.
crazy. You're like plugging in something in your phone and like peeing on a stick. I don't know. It seems wild to me.
There's lots of different technologies. Some are checking your basal body temperature because there are fluctuations in your body temperature throughout the ovulatory cycle. Some are looking for changes in your hormones and specifically what's called an LH surge,
Sure.
or an increase in luteinizing hormone. So there are different technologies, and you can try multiple of them and see if you're sort of getting accurate information for all of them. Again, there are sort of low tech ways of just sort of taking your own temperature or checking your cervical mucus every day and looking for changes. And
What
there's a
does
lot of
one,
information.
what's the change in your like if it's thicker, if it's a different color, like what is that?
Exactly. So cervical mucus usually is pretty like thin, transparent, see-through, watery kind of. And then mid-cycle, it will often become thicker, more mucousy, and that's a sign that ovulation is happening or has just happened. So those are some of the changes to look for. Um, and then, in addition to all of these things, to sort of track your cycle, understand, do you even have regular cycles? Are you ovulating? When do you ovulate compared to when you have your LH surge? When do you ovulate compared to the first day of your period? I think the social aspect of this is also really important too, right? Like create a network of people around you with whom you feel comfortable talking to going through this. In my patients who are queer and trying to get pregnant, sometimes they can have this tension of opposites where they're like super excited about the idea and like wanting to get pregnant, but also just like pissed at having to like go through all this, right? Like
Mm,
compared to
yeah.
other couples or under other individuals who are just like, oops, I got pregnant. They're having to like be super deliberate about this and track their periods and potentially take injections and take medications and undergo somewhat invasive procedures. And that can feel heavy and unfair sometimes.
Mm,
And so I think it's really important to have a social network around you who aren't going to judge you and can commiserate and empathize with you about those contrasting feelings all at the same time. The process can also take a while and there
right.
can be multiple disappointments along the way of, okay, I think I'm ovulating but I'm not, or I think I'm getting, I might get pregnant because I ovulated and then you might not, or you might even get pregnant and then it doesn't stick, or you might have an early
Hmm.
miscarriage, because a lot of people don't realize that many early pregnancies don't last, and we sort of just see them as our periods, right? So there can be a lot of disappointments that can take a lot of time and frankly can be expensive, and all of
Yeah.
that again can feel really unfair.
Yes. And I mean, I think about even some of my friends were like, oops, yeah, I just got, like drunk and pregnant. And you're like,
Yeah,
damn, dude, I wish.
right.
I mean, I say it all the time. Not that you should not need to have any alcohol or whatever to get pregnant. Have a good night, whatever that looks like for you. If that's eating a
Yes.
bunch of candy or having a couple of cocktails, whatever. I just laugh because I'm like, oh, come on. I wish I could get accidentally
Yeah.
pregnant because it is this balance of really trying to stay calm. And it's interesting. AMH, can you explain what an AMH level is?
Anti-Mullerian hormone. So there are like various tests that we can do to sort of see your what's called ovarian reserve,
Hmm.
or how many eggs you have left in the tank, for lack of a better comparison. It's that's one of the blood tests that's used to just sort of say like, are you ovulating, and how long might you have, or how many cycles might you have to be able to try to get pregnant.
So this is something that I've done now twice, and it's like the first thing when I went to this previous doctor, he asked me, and I was like, 0.47. He's like, oof, that's real low. And you start to like panic, basically.
Yeah,
You're like, oh my God. But then what's really interesting is that was last year. I've spent 6.5 months going to my incredible acupuncturist, which we talk about Russell all the time on this show. And my AMH increased significantly. It's now
amazing.
0.69. Is Are there things, and I'm not asking you if acupuncture is, whatever, because I know it's some people say it works, some people don't. I know it kind of can get tricky in the medical field about like, I don't know the validity of acupuncture. It worked for me, but are there other things like even diet, exercise, etc. people can do to increase AMH? Because I didn't think you could. Is it
So I
stress? Is it
mean,
related to stress sometimes? Like how? I don't know.
yeah, it's important to know that like we people with uteruses and ovaries are born with all of the ovaries that they're ever going to have,
Right.
like at the time they're born, right? Like
Sure.
that doesn't change. And that's in part why fertility for people with a uterus and ovaries declines over time. I was just having this conversation with my kids the other day, and I was like, I have a kid who's non-binary and has a uterus. And I was like, you were born with all of your gametes and they're just going to decline over time. And your brother can like make sperm until he's like 70. Like it's fascinating. But we were talking about this in the context of his
Robert
genetics
De
exam.
Niro, 80 years
Yeah.
old, just having
Yeah.
a kid with a
Yeah.
29-year-old. It's like crazy over
Again,
here.
totally unfair, but like this is the reality. And it's important for people to like understand that. And so they can make decisions about their fertility and when they might or might not want to have kids. Um, so that is true. Like whether or not there are things that we can do to change the AMH hormone, I don't know. And it is true that acupuncture in like randomized controlled trials has been proven to help with some health conditions, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot that we don't understand, even about medicines that we use, and certainly about acupuncture and other techniques. There are, and also just a level set, like pregnancy requires a functional uterus, functional tubes, functional ovaries. And so it's actually kind of amazing that like that anyone gets pregnant,
I
because like
know,
anything
right?
can go wrong with any of those parameters. And there can be either subfertility or decreased fertility or infertility. Um, the most common causes of infertility are actually tubal disease related to
Mm.
sexually transmitted infections, which goes back to our prior conversation. So I think it's really important for people to understand that sexually transmitted infections are rising in this country. Important to have open and honest conversations with your partner or partners, protect yourself, use condoms, get tested frequently, and get treated if you have an STI, because a lingering STI can cause a lot of damage to the tubes that can then lead to decreased fertility or infertility in the long run. Um, you know, are there other things that people can do other than avoiding STIs? Most of the literature supports not smoking at all, that smoking can have an impact with the motility of the fallopian tubes and fertility. Alcohol, too much alcohol can be a real factor. And then, of course, just like eating a healthy diet, trying to reduce stress. Those are all things that are hard to do, right? And so I think just um, you know, being reasonable and making sure that you're not stressing yourself out more by trying to lead a super healthy life and do all the right things, but certainly doing whatever was in your power to try to reduce stress as much as you can without it feeling like a whole other job or a whole other thing to manage.
Because it can feel like a whole nother job and a
Yeah.
it is tough. You talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, even, educating people about not just how to not get pregnant or how to get pregnant, but also about pleasure.
Yes.
I connected with an old acquaintance of mine who is now probably in her late 40s, almost 50, but she and I were talking about something completely different. We were actually talking about voters' rights and all the other fun things going on in the world. And, she said, well, and she asked me about my, kind of parent journey. And she said, well, I have a daughter. I said, yes, no. I saw that, on Facebook or what have you. And she said, I got pregnant myself at almost 46 years old. And I said, well, talk to me. She said, can I give you my unsolicited advice? I said, sure, let's hear it. She said, I masturbated 1 to 2 times a day for a year, lived a healthy lifestyle. She did a lot of self-help work on herself, which I love, regardless if you're trying to get pregnant or not. 10 out of 10 recommend loving yourself and working on yourself. And then she did at home, which is I think there's so many ways of what they call IUI, IVF, IC. I think it's IVF. She had a friend of hers ejaculate, and she used an
Hmm.
at-home kit to get pregnant herself. And she was really dead set that having an orgasm while insemination is happening is what gets you pregnant. I could not find any information online about that. Is orgasming important to happen while you're trying to get pregnant? Like, does it matter?
So I think there has been like one or two studies to show that there was an increased rate of pregnancy with people who had heterosexual, like penis and vagina sex.
Mm-hmm.
But it hasn't been rigorously studied in like a randomized controlled trial. That would be a very hard thing to study. That being said, like, I'm never gonna like block someone's orgasm. So if someone
Sure.
feels like that might be important to them in their process or they're comfortable with that, that sounds amazing. Theoretically, it could help, right? Like when someone orgasms, there are uterine contractions. The uterine contractions could help to open up the cervix a little bit, and
Mm.
maybe theres a difference there. But it's really hard to say that the literature fully supports that.
But also, like, I'm not going to be at the doctor's office getting IUI or IVF and like, or that's crazy. Like, am I
I
gonna?
mean,
Do people do? I don't
people
know.
have
What?
orgasms to give sperm donations, right?
Yeah,
Or
but the
like,
doctor's
like
not in the
after,
room.
no, not in the room.
See
Yeah,
what I'm
that's
saying?
true.
So that's like the crazy part. Okay, well, thank you for at least sort of clear. I mean, I think you cleared it up for me, but I'm like, I
Yeah,
mean, from what is out there. But I was like, girl, I don't know about that.
yeah.
I was like, I
But
don't know.
at home insemination is a
Sure.
possibility. And I think there probably aren't that many, but there are some providers who will do at home intrauterine insemination as well.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, mine won't, and that's okay. But I was just I was like, I don't know. I was like, there is a lot happening over here. I don't know if I can handle that whole additional vulnerability while going
Yeah,
through this,
yeah.
But yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Are there any like wives' tales about getting pregnant that you're like, let me just clear this up? Like,
Oh, so many, I would say. You know, the probably like the funniest one you can like picture is like the woman with like her legs straight up after
oh
having
yes.
sex. Yeah.
That's not real. Oh, she also
Um,
told me to do that. This woman told me that she inseminated herself, had an orgasm, and then had her legs up against the wall, like L-shaped, for 4 hours and fell asleep. I was like, oh no, I don't know if that's good for you.
I know.
Four
Like, could
hours
she
up
walk
against the wall?
afterwards with her legs asleep? Like, I don't even know how
They
that works,
had to
but
have been asleep. Okay, so that's a
yeah.
wives' tale.
Yeah, I mean, most providers will recommend sort of just like lifting your pelvis a little bit on a pillow just for a little while to make sure that the semen stays down in the back of the vagina and has the chance to swim up to the cervix. But like legs straight up in the air for a long period of time, no. Um, there are a lot of old like wives' tales around sort of like having sex at the certain cycle of the moon to help dictate
Mm,
the sex of the baby. And yeah, don't think that has worked. But if someone figures that out, they'll probably be a millionaire.
And
But
they
yeah, there are
definitely
lots
live
of
in Silver Lake in Los Angeles. And they have like a tarot card, you know, like
totally.
law or whatever. Okay, so those are wives' tales that don't work. All right, that makes sense. Yeah, the moon. I mean, maybe some people really feel like I for a moment felt like I was really getting my period at the full moon of every month, but then that sort of changed. And I was like,
Mm.
I don't know if I just sort of
You
made
were
that up.
synced up with the moon. That's
Synced up with
fascinating.
the moon. Yeah, I don't know if that was real, but maybe for a minute. I don't know. Yeah, just definitely changed. Okay, so ladies, you don't need to just have your legs go numb in the air because that seems ridiculous. That's a pretty strong wives' tales, though.
Yeah.
That one sticks for
And
sure.
uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a dear friend who was on this show, and we spoke about it a little bit. Winter. She went viral, like on Good Morning America vibes, viral about
Wow.
writing an article that she was taking Ozempic to try to get pregnant. Ozempic is something that a lot of my listeners are on. I'm on another show, a lot of Ozempic talk. We are not Ozempic shamers here. I am not. I'm like, do you with your body. Oprah, you look amazing. I don't know why anybody would shame Oprah at this point about her body. I just read that she was like, I'm over it. I'm on Ozempic. Leave me alone. Like, leave Oprah alone. Um, but it was interesting because Winter was like, listen, I was overweight. I was technically obese and I was having a really, really hard time with IVF. And my doctor had suggested this and it's changed my life and I love it, etc. Me trying to get pregnant, I was advised by a few, like my OB and a few other doctors to not, and I'm not on Ozempic, but to not take Ozempic because there wasn't enough studies about being on it. Have you
Yeah.
seen an uptick with patients or even on TikTok asking about trying to get pregnant and being on Ozempic, or if you're on Ozempic and you should go off of it if you get pregnant? I feel like it's so zeitgeisty right now.
Yeah. It's a really good question. So, I mean, these drugs are relatively new, right?
Yeah,
Although they have been around in sort of clinical trials for a
sure.
while, and they have not been studied in people who are pregnant, right? So whether they can be used before someone gets pregnant, if they want to lose weight, or that's important to help them regulate their ovulation, um, you know, that's possible, but it is true that they have not been studied during pregnancy. So it's going to be really important that someone stops it before they're actually pregnant, right? Because we don't know if there could be negative risks to the fetus, and that could cause problems with the baby in the future. Um, Another thing, though, that we have seen is sort of conversely, that providers who are giving these medications sometimes aren't even aware of, is that Mounjaro, one of the injectable medications that was approved for type 2 diabetes, and the newer version was most recently approved for weight loss, that on the label itself, it says that it could decrease the efficacy of birth control and that people using it should use a backup method or a different method. So that's something that's important
Ooh,
for, yeah, your listeners to know. Um,
that's super important. Who
Yeah,
even
and it's
cares
just
about the
like,
pregnancy part? That's the most important part we should be talking
yeah,
about. So wait, wow. Because again,
yeah,
you were saying at the beginning that a lot of people ask you about different medications or smoking or drinking or what have you, or cannabis
exactly.
in regards to the efficacy of birth control, but a lot of people are on Mounjaro.
A lot
So
of
that
people
would
are
be
on
good
these
to know.
medications and they don't know this. And again, I've been asking like all the providers I know who are prescribing this if this is something they're counseling their patients about, and they didn't even know. But if you, I mean, you can just like look it up yourself, it's on the
Sure.
label, but like who reads the label like of all these medications? Because there's a lot of stuff on there. But yeah, the way that it works in part is by decreasing gastric emptying. So that can cause decreased efficacy of the birth control pills specifically, not other types of birth control like the ring or the patch or intrauterine devices, but
Oh
for
yeah,
people
because
who
you're
take
taking
pills
it
by mouth.
orally. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So they recommend that if you are taking the pills, consider switching to another method, or if you want to stay on the pill because it's working for you, to use a backup method like internal or external condoms for 4 weeks after your initial injection and for 4 weeks after any time the dose has changed.
Yikes.
Yes.
So
Yeah. So we have a little
ladies,
explainer.
use condoms. That's crazy. I mean, because I think you're injecting yourself every week, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So just 4 weeks after the initial injection. And then, if the dose doesn't change,
Oh,
then you
got it.
should
If
be
the
good.
dose
But if they
changes.
up your dose, right, then you'd have to use a backup method again for 4 weeks. We have a little explainer video about this on TikTok, as well as a FAQ article on our website, Bedsider. But it's something that people really don't know about. And I've heard a number of doctors being like, or providers saying, like, I'm really concerned we're going to have a bunch of like, Wegovy babies in the future.
100%. I mean, yeah, I would think a lot of Wegovy babies because a lot of people are on Wegovy. It's very hard to get. And I think at least a lot of the people that I know that are on those drugs are feeling better about themselves and maybe they're having more sex. So yeah, maybe we're gonna see quite a bit of Wegovy babies. I mean, I just did a lot of my own research about antidepressants and pregnancy because I'm on an antidepressant
Hmm.
and I don't want to go off of it. So and my practitioner was like, listen, I can't make this decision for like, here are all of the medical research and journals.
Yep.
You know what is very tedious and long and hard to read are those studies. But
Yes.
I'm grateful that he told me to do that because it is important. I think just as it is important to, you know, speak to a practitioner, like really do that research to try. You have to be your own advocate is the end
Absolutely.
of the day. And so I was glad that I was like, oh my God, are you giving me a homework assignment? Just tell me if I can stay on these things or not. Oh, and he's like, no, you got to make that decision for yourself. I can't
Yeah.
make that for you. So um maybe we should read the labels. Oh,
Yeah, I mean, that's what's hard, right? About like being a provider and being a patient or a person is like these things are often complicated. The research is showing you en masse on a population basis what they've found, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be your individual experience, right?
right.
And we need to have better ways to communicate risks in a way that people understand. If you start talking about big numbers like 1 out of 1 million, like what does that mean to me? I don't even understand, it's hard to
Crazy.
conceptualize. So we need to have better tools to sort of help people communicate about risks, and increase literacy so that people can make informed decisions and say, you know what, I understand this. I understand what the risk is for me. And now I understand that I am going to continue taking this medication that's important for me, or I understand the risks and I'm going to go off of it. And this is how.
Yeah. It's been hard to find, even I live in LA. It's a huge metropolitan city. There's lots of folks, lots of practitioners. It's been hard for me to find practitioners. I mean, you go
Yeah.
word of mouth, which is typically, I think, what most people do. I remember first moving to LA and I'm like, dude, how, like, what? Like, how do I find a dentist? I go to a children's dentist because I really like her and somebody referred me, which is sort of insane because I curse all the time and I like go in and there's Hello Kitties and Karopis everywhere and I'm like, whatever. But I love Dr. Emily. Shout out Dr. Emily. Don't care if it's like for kids. She's my only girl for my teeth. But especially when it comes to IU, any type of fertility practitioner,
Yeah.
even OB, it's tough because it's really, really personal. I went to one doctor, he was fine, but it didn't feel right. So I really had to sit with it and try to find someone else. Do you have I mean, you're so wonderful. You live so far away
Oh,
from me, so I can't
thank you.
bark up your tree, my practitioner, but how do you have any tips or tricks or recommendations for somebody looking to find any kind of care in wherever they live?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is really hard, right? And we sort of started this conversation talking about how people are increasingly accessing information online, which is true. We just
Hmm.
recently did a survey of young people, and it showed that 25% of respondents received information about birth control from social media in the last year, which is a big number. But 86 of them actually had preferred to receive information from a healthcare provider. And
Hmm.
that part of that gap could be just what you're talking about, is like just how difficult it is to find a provider, period, let alone a provider that you're comfortable with. And you and I are like living in these coastal cities where there's
Right.
lots of healthcare institutions. Imagine you're in like the middle of America, or in a rural community. Also where the practitioner is also like, the person who leads your church or synagogue, or, your mom's friend. So
Literally my worst nightmare. I'll never,
yes,
my first doctor was like, because I lived in a smaller town, was like
yeah,
everybody's friend and I hated him. He
yeah,
was so like I remember being a kid and just hating going to the doctor, but he was like the town doctor. And
Like
I
if
was
that's
like,
your only option,
it
right?
was
Yeah.
terrible. It's terrible.
So again, that's why it's really important the work that we're doing to increase access to information where people are and democratize access so that even if you are someone in a rural community who doesn't have someone that you can talk to, you at least have this important information. But sometimes you do need to go in and to see a provider. And so I highly recommend that people, reach out to friends and family members and get personal recommendations if they can. There's a ton of reviews on the internet, which, take with a grain of salt, but certainly do your research. If someone is looking for a provider for reproductive health services, they can visit our clinic finder on bedsider.org, where we have more than 13,000 in-person and telehealth clinics. That's something else really important to note is that, telehealth is increasing access to conversations with providers for mental health, for reproductive health, and many other things. So that's also a great modality to be able to find a provider that works for you. And if you navigate all of that journey and finally found a provider and it just doesn't feel right to you, don't be afraid to look for another option or to ask questions or say, like, actually, I don't feel like you're listening to me or understanding me. This is my situation. This is my partner. This is, what I need. Don't feel like you can't push back. I feel like we were all trained to sort of be differential to the white coat and to providers, and that has led to a situation where there's a lot of bias in healthcare, or people don't feel listened to, and frankly, really bad outcomes in this country. And so we have to empower patients, unfortunately, to feel comfortable sticking up for themselves if they don't feel like they're getting the care that they need.
You are my new favorite follow on TikTok. Even though I am actively trying to get pregnant, not trying to get pregnant, but you're doing really, really important special work. And I was so happy to find you and find out about you. And I'm so grateful that you came on Cool to just educate me and my listeners. And it's a rough world out there and you're doing like really important work. So thank you so much. I really, really mean it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to talk about this work that I'm so passionate about at this time where there are crazy attacks on reproductive health care. It's fun to have this really good conversation with you and to destigmatize all of these topics in a meaningful way.
And I didn't think I was going to get teary, but I'm PMSing so hard. I'm like, why am I starting to cry saying goodbye to you on my show? Welcome to Cool, guys, where crying is cool. There you go. I gotta go track. Now I need to go track my
That's
ovulation.
right. You might be ovulating.
No, I can't be. I'm about to get my period.
Oh, yeah, no, that's just PMS. That's just PMS.
You are wonderful. Thank you.